Welcome. I'm David Meyer. I'm the dean here at the law school, and so pleased to welcome you to this third annual Sustainability in Future Cities boot camp. This is this year, as I suppose every year, but this year's headlines just reinforce the importance and timeliness of the discussions of this project. I was thinking about the headlines that seeing the earthquake in, not our earthquake, though that one too counts, but thinking of the earthquake in Taiwan recently and having read of the staggering difference in human toll taken at that quake as compared to the last big earthquake in Taiwan, which I think killed thousands of people, and that difference was attributed to planning and more greater care and sort of raising the standards of building, and so just that example of the importance of planning for the future, and I was thrilled to come here this past summer to Brooklyn from New Orleans, where I had been for 13 years at Tulane University, and of course here, every coastal city in America and the world is threatened, of course, by seismic changes which are coming in sea level rise, and so just two examples of the importance of the discussions to be had here. I'm thrilled to welcome back welcome this distinguished panel and our distinguished keynote speaker, and welcome back to alumni as well to participate on the panel, as well as to moderate with Professor Solson. So welcome. And it's next my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. We're really honored to have Rohit Agarwal here with us to kick us off. He was appointed Commissioner of the New York City Department of Environmental Protection and the city's chief climate officer in early 2022. Under his leadership, the department has embraced a leading role in addressing both stormwater and coastal resilience. It's streamlined procurement processes and internal financial management in order to invest more in infrastructure and to raise water revenues well beyond budget by $250 million above budget, which is an impressive accomplishment. I wish we could match here at Brooklyn Law School, but you've set the bar for us in the future. As Chief Climate Officer, he has also led the development of New York City's most recent sustainability plan. I think it's called Plan NYC, and previous to the Adams administration, Mr. Agarwal served as the first director of New York City's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, where he led to the creation of the first iteration of that sustainability plan. He's also then played a founding role in environmental grant making for the Bloomberg Philanthropies, and served as president of the board of directors of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He has a collection of degrees from Columbia University, 3 BA, MBA, and PhD, and also has an MA from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, to top it off. So, Mr. Agarwal, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dean. And it's really good to be here and to talk to you tonight. And I thought I'd pick up on 3 things to share. One, actually picking up on what the Dean just said about my background, and something Emily and I were talking about a little bit is how far sustainability has come. Because I will say, and I will get to the doom and gloom, I promise, but it is a little bit easy to revel in the doom and gloom and lose sight of the fact that we've come a long way. on sustainability. New York City, as a city, started its journey on sustainability in 2006. So on the one hand, it's a long time ago. On the other hand, it's not that long ago. And at the time, we were very much a leader. There were only a handful of cities that were taking sustainability seriously in a systematic way. And since then, we've done a great deal, right? New York City has had not one round, but 2 rounds of nation-leading, aggressive, mandatory efforts to green existing buildings, which I'll come back to because I know that's our theme of our panel, and I want to end there. We've done a tremendous amount to clean the air far above and beyond what federal mandates required us to do. But frankly, as a byproduct, we are now kind of shockingly in compliance with the Clean Air Act, right? Which I think even 20 years ago, people would have said, this will never happen, we'll just muddle through in kind of a negotiated compliance. But we're actually there now, primarily thanks to the banning of dirty heating oil, which is finally going to take the final step where we will fully ban number 4 heating oil that goes out of use in New York City in a couple of years. I will confess, I recently called one of my own inspectors to come and watch the building across the street from my apartment, which is one of the last number 4 buildings in Manhattan, and it drives me crazy every time I see that plume of black smoke come out across from my window. But nonetheless, they still have the legal right to do it, sadly, for a little while longer, but I will win. And then, as the dean was talking about, there is this challenge. It's one of several that you could term existential around resilience and adapting to climate change. And I will point out, we have a long ways to go on resilience, but we've actually come a long way that is not necessarily visible to all New Yorkers. So the reality is, we've begun, because hurricane season is almost upon us, and so beginning to think about how we will talk about this upcoming hurricane season, which unfortunately the NOAA is projecting to be an above average hurricane season. So we dodged the bullet last summer. We didn't have a hurricane in any meaningful way. There's a reasonable chance we'll get hit this year. And as we look at what we are doing on coastal resilience, and I frequently get asked, so are we any better protected than we were 12 and a half years ago when Hurricane Sandy hit? And the answer is, it doesn't seem that way, but the reality is we are much better. We aren't protected. We aren't in a place yet where we can prevent the kind of flooding that Hurricane Sandy inflicted on us. But what we've been doing a lot of is ensuring that we are actually resilient. And those are 2 separate things. You do some of each, but we are actually resilient in a way that we weren't. And so whereas what Hurricane Sandy did to the city was create flooding, of course, yes, that was visible. But the real problem beyond the 40 lives that were lost that night was the fact that it took so many New Yorkers so long to get back to normal. Right? And so those of you who are around and remember that, right, we had power plants that were down not for hours, not for days, but for weeks. DEP, the agency I now run, had wastewater treatment plants that were out not for hours, not for days, but for weeks. We had people in apartment buildings, and particularly in NYCHA housing, where they lost their elevators not for hours, not for days, but for weeks, and in some cases, months. Right? Now, can I be sure it'll all work the way it's supposed to? Of course not. But given what we have done and what is doable in a relatively short period of time, the city has used a lot of federal money. A total of roughly $12 billion has been given to the city, and a large portion of that has gone to ensuring that buildings and critical facilities are protected or are resilient. So that NYCHA complex, it's still going to get flooded, and it's still going to lose its elevator, but it'll lose its elevator for 12 hours, right? And that's manageable. That doesn't cripple people. That doesn't hurt them. That doesn't make them leave their homes and their neighborhoods. And the same is true for our critical facilities, where we may not be able to prevent damage, but we can prevent long-lasting damage. And the nice thing is, because that's focused on the building, you can do that in small chunks. The bigger projects take longer, And we're now just beginning to see the fruits of that kind of work, where on the Lower East Side, I'm sure many of you are aware, we've got a 1.5 mile long seawall that's under construction. If we get a hurricane this summer, it will do no good, because a half-built seawall doesn't keep the water out, right? But 2 years from now, when it is complete and operational, and 2 years from now when the portion south of it is also expected to be complete and operational, and 2.5, maybe 3 years from now when our project in Red Hook is complete and operational, and 2 years from now, maybe 3, when the project that will break ground later this year on the south shore of Staten Island, which lost the most lives during Hurricane Sandy, when that is built, we will have large parts of the city that are in fact protected against coastal surge. So there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel on this. And I think it's important for us to celebrate that and recognize that this has not been work in vain, even though it's a little bit invisible. So that's the good news. The bad news is we have so much farther to go. And among the things that we wrestle with when it comes to climate change adaptation is the fact that, unfortunately, in the United States, we are, and this is perhaps in contrast, as the Dean was citing the example of Taiwan, in contrast to places around the world that are more technocratic, are more comfortable with planning. We are very reactive. So one of the things we have started working on in the last 2 years in this administration is recognizing the fact that 100% of the work that has gone on coastal resilience in New York City has been in those neighborhoods that were hurt by Hurricane Sandy, because federal money is only about addressing damage that has already happened. And the reality is that there are parts of New York City that are every bit as vulnerable to a very similar flood. But just because of the wind and the tide and whatever was going on that particular night, they were safe, right? And those neighborhoods have had no protection, no planning even. And so that's something we've started. We've got a project called Climate Strong Communities, where we're going into those neighborhoods that have unaddressed vulnerability, doing neighborhood level planning. One of the opportunities for us now is, because there is federal money available thanks to the BIL and the IRA, that part of what we need to do is put together project plans. And if we can do that in conjunction with the community, those will have a high likelihood of success. And so that's one of the ways that we are investing small amounts of city money in the hopes of leveraging much larger amounts of federal money and getting that complete. We are also beginning to work towards a comprehensive approach to coastal resilience, which is one of our key challenges, but that is the work not of months and not of years, but in fact of decades. And the reality is we will only be fully protected at some point when I am certainly going to be retired and probably no longer with us, because we've got a long ways to go. And I know this is a boot camp, hopefully for some students in the audience and watching. The reality is that we have to think about coastal resilience and climate change adaptation more broadly, not as a project, not as something that will have an end point, right? We don't ask, when will the Department of Education be finished, right? It's an ongoing task. And I think, unfortunately, the reality is that as the climate is almost certainly going to continue to change for 100 years or more, that we are always going to be playing a certain amount of catch-up. And it is mind-boggling how much this will cost. And this is, I think, one of the things that I am certainly eager, frankly, to bear bad news and start engaging with New Yorkers on, the recognition that it is going to cost a breathtaking sum of money, and there is no cavalry, right? As much money as we think the feds and the state might help us with, the vast majority of New York's climate change adaptation is going to be paid for by people who live in the 5 boroughs. Some of that when it comes to stormwater, which is kind of new. I mean, unfortunately, and this is a mistake that I think the city and every other level of government fell into, after Hurricane Sandy, we did a lot of planning against coastal inundation. It took Hurricane Ida 2.5 years ago to remind us that coastal inundation is not the only way New York could flood, that stormwater is also the way New York can flood. And we lost 11 lives that night 2.5 years ago. And we had the reminder back in September that Another one could hit us. We were lucky for having a storm back on September 29th that hit during the morning rush hour, not that many people asleep in basement apartments, so we didn't lose any lives, which is what I was worried about that morning as the weather intensified. But nonetheless, there was a lot of property damage, there was a lot of inconvenience, and it was a reminder that we are going to have to work really hard to keep up. 2023 was one of our wettest years on record. Some of you may know that there is the concept of the 5-year storm, the 10-year storm, levels of storm intensity that are supposed to come at certain statistical intervals. The 5-year storm is what we try to design the sewers to accommodate. And the idea behind that is, well, you know, if a basement gets flooded once every 5 years, that's probably a manageable level, right? New York City in 2023 had 5 5-year storms. Right? We got it somewhat backwards. Now, the statisticians in the audience will point out, well, that was at different places in the city, so it didn't actually happen 5 times at the same place. But nonetheless, New York City as a whole experienced 5 storms that broached the 5-year time horizon or probability. And it's going to require us to think very differently about our stormwater infrastructure. We will not be able to build sewers to accommodate the level of rainfall that we got on September 29th or during Hurricane Ida. We've looked. In some cases, literally, the streets are not wide enough to accommodate a sewer that size. We would make the decision to tear down buildings, widen streets in order to build sewers like that. So it is going to have to be a mix of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure. Last year, we announced that the city is beginning to work on a buyout strategy, so a framework where we can buy out property that is too difficult or impossible or perhaps too expensive to protect. And usually the goal will be to turn that into infrastructure that can protect the surrounding area with blue belts or green infrastructure or things like that. Our best number right now is that even achieving a basic level of preparedness for the weather that we're going to have 30 years from now is a $30 billion retrofit. My agency's entire capital budget for the next 10 years is $31 billion, right? So that implies something on the order of a 50% increase in water bills across New York City because there's no other way to pay for it. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is working on a plan to do coastal defense for the entire New York Harbor area. Their current number, and when was a big long-term infrastructure project ever done at the price it was initially estimated at, their current number is $57 billion. Right? And that won't be complete until 2050. And so one of the things that we are realizing is not only is there going to be a massive economic impact that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with, but whatever we do is still going to require buildings, and here I'm going to get a bit to the subject of the panel, to be part of the solution. We have really not thought about buildings as part of our stormwater management system, but they are, because eventually, if the water can't fill the sewers anymore and it can't fill the streets, where does it go? It goes into buildings. Right? And we are going to have to start thinking about that intentionally and designing buildings that are resilient so that they can flood regularly without causing long-term damage. And that is going to be a big shift because it means that people will have to use their basements differently. And we will have to design buildings and in many cases retrofit buildings differently. And retrofitting buildings, again, is, I know, what the topic of the panel, so I want to seed you guys with stuff you can actually talk about. But, of course, I've talked thus far about adaptation, resilience, how do we deal with the climate problem, but that climate problem is only continuing to get worse. And just some of you probably saw over the last few days, there was further data indicating that, sadly, the world has not yet changed its trajectory. There was a little bit of hope that maybe 2023 was the year of peak emissions. Did not happen. We are still getting worse, not better. And of course, the first thing that you really need to do when you find yourself in a hole is to stop digging, stop making the problem worse. And New York has been a leader in that. We will continue to be a leader in that. After 17 years, we may get congestion pricing implemented this year. We have been trying to do that. I have been trying to do that since 2007. But the biggest thing that we have to do to deal with the climate crisis in New York City, the biggest contribution we can make is to green our existing buildings. And that is also going to be difficult. It is also going to be expensive, and it is also going to be a long-term challenge. The good news on that is as difficult and as expensive as it is manageable, because we do have time in the time scale of building management. And what we have been trying to do is figure out how to make aggressive standards for the decarbonization of buildings achievable for the people who own and manage and live in and work in those buildings, because that is the only way. We can make whatever goals we want, but if they are in fact unachievable for a large segment of buildings, they simply will not happen. Local Law 97, of course, is the main vehicle that we have to do that. Local Law 97 was enacted by the City Council in 2019. I do not have to tell you that 2019 feels like a lifetime ago from the point of view of the economy, of the real estate industry, and of, frankly, society in general. And the realities of how we implement Local Law 97 fell to this administration. And so we came in 2 years ago and took on the task of writing all of the rules for how we were actually going to enforce this law. And it took a lot of work. We did it. We got all of the important rules out by the end of last year. It was not without controversy, because, of course, some advocates have said, oh, you're giving away the store. In fact, one of the things that we were forced to wrestle with was the extent to which building codes are actually a really flawed tool to drive energy efficiency and decarbonization, for one very simple reason. They are an after-the-fact approach to compliance. Right? And so the mechanism that's written into Local Law 97, which most people do not appreciate, is that the law took effect this year in 2024. Something on the order of 25,000 buildings are now going to have to report to the Department of Buildings what their carbon emissions were in the year 2024. That report is not due until May of 2025. If the Department of Buildings decides that there's a violation, they send that violation over to the Office of Administrative Tribunals and Hearings, and it could take a year or two for a violation to work its way through, and so a building might go until 2027 before it ever gets a fine for 2024. At which point, presumably, there have been another 3 years of emissions going into the atmosphere, right? And so we might fine that building, but boy, we have won the battle and lost the war when it comes to actually saving the planet. And furthermore, the targets for 2024 are, in a way, a dress rehearsal, because they affect a very small number of buildings. We think there's a total of maybe 1,500 buildings around the city that have to do work to comply with their 2024 targets. But there are probably 15,000 buildings that have to do much more aggressive work to comply with their 2030 targets, right? And it's in 2030 that we really see the planetary benefits of Local Law 97 if it is complied with. But if you think about what I said about 2024, the fact is we will not know whether buildings are doing any of the work until 2031, right? At which point, it's a little late, because if you've been a manager, or you've been a teacher, or you've been a parent, you know that it is not a winning strategy to tell your kid, that test you have on Friday, I want you to do really well, and a week afterwards, when I get the results back from your teacher, if you don't do well, I'm going to punish you. Good luck, I'll talk to you when you get the results back. Not a good management approach, right? What do? You get in front of the problem. You sit with your kid and say, I'm going to sit with you while you study, well in advance, right? But that is not a tool that's available to the Department of Buildings. And so one of the things we put into the rule was actually a device to try to approximate that, where what we said is, if you are in violation in 2024, we're going to give you a grace period. We're not going to fine you for those first 2 years while you come into compliance. But in exchange, you have to give us a binding plan for how you're going to get to 2030, and we're not wiping away your debt. We're going to hold it in abeyance. And if in 2029 you stop work on your 2030 compliance plan, then we are going to fine you for what you did in 2024, right? And so what we're trying to do is take this coarse tool of building code enforcement and turn it into a management tool for how we get buildings to do work that they may not know quite how to do. And this is the final thing that I'll point out about Local Law 97, and I'm sure some of you on the panel can speak to this, It's very easy to imagine that greening buildings in New York is about making billionaire real estate developers do work on their shiny Class A office buildings in Midtown. The reality is the majority of our building-related emissions come from residential buildings, not from office buildings. The majority of our emissions from residential buildings do not come from luxury skyscrapers in the Upper East Side or over here in Park Slope or Brooklyn Heights. They come from Flushing and from the Grand Concourse and from Upper Manhattan. And it is constantly surprising to people who don't know that there are lots of co-ops in the Bronx and there are lots of condos in Flushing. And those are buildings that are going to have to comply. They are not all rich people. What's even more so is they're not really sophisticated building managers either, right? And so what I am constantly encountering on this topic is the fact that not only do they not have reserves, they have an amateur board that runs the building, people who may not have any real estate experience, and in some cases, I've encountered a lot of buildings where they don't even have a management agent. In order to save money, they rely on the superintendent to fill out all the paperwork. And then they come to me and say, oh, our building, it's going to cost us $1 gazillion to comply with Local Law 97. And I say, okay, how'd you find that out? They say, my boiler guy told me, right? And that's the level of sophistication that we are dealing with. And so one of our challenges, one of our many challenges, is how do we help buildings that are fundamentally unsophisticated, which is the majority of our buildings in New York City. How do we get them to do something that is challenging, that is not driven by the demands of the people who live there or who own the property, and that is going to require significant investment? And the biggest thing we have to do is find the money, because we think it is going to cost $15 billion for buildings in New York City to meet their 2030 targets. The Class A office building in Midtown, fine. They've got consultants, they've got advisors, they've got the credit. They're not what I'm worried about. But it is that co-op on the Grand Concourse, it is that condo in Flushing that I'm very worried about, and we have got to find tools for them. I have been going around for the last year asking for help from the state, from the Public Service Commission, from NYSERDA, from the federal government. The federal government just gave out $15 billion in greenhouse gas reduction fund money, and I am desperately hoping that some of those lenders are going to realize that through Local Law 97, we have forced a bunch of potential clients to their door. They just have to create the generous approaches to giving that financing away. And the city is going to be there. I'm very optimistic the City Council will endorse a renewal of the J51 property tax credit, which many of those low and moderate value co-ops and condos will be able to use to pay for 80% of what they have to spend for Local Law 97 compliance. But that's a 15-year tax credit. They have to have the money to pay for it, and then they'll get it back over time. So we still need a financing mechanism, even when we have found a funding mechanism. And so this is where I will leave you and turn it over to the panel, because at the end of the day, we've done the policy work, right? Between New York City, New York State has the CLCPA, the federal government has done the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Climate action in New York City is no longer about policy. Climate action in New York City is about the nuts and bolts of implementation. That is much harder, and that is where we are going to have to wrestle with the difficulty of getting things done. It's going to be where we have to wrestle with the expense and how we fund these things, but because we can't wave our hands anymore, we have to deal with the reality of the situation. The good news is that just like protecting those NYCHA buildings, just like building the seawalls, this is where we actually start to make progress. And so this is the exciting part of the challenge, but it is no less challenging for it. So with that, I want to thank you. There's a ton of work to be done. We need all the help we can get. We need lawyers too. All of these contracts require lawyers, so I'm very excited that Brooklyn Law School is interested. And I think I'm turning it over now to you, Professor. And I want to thank you for your attention. Thanks.
You guys could come up and sit down. Thank you, Commissioner, for sharing with us and providing a great overview of what we can look forward to from New York City. I believe we are in good hands with you. I'm Richard Sobelson, Professor of Practice and Adjunct Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. Welcome to our third annual Sustainability and Future Cities Boot Camp. In a little less than 2 weeks, we will celebrate another Earth Day. And although there is a lot that challenges us environmentally and geopolitically, programs like this give hope that we'll eventually have a more secure and healthy globe. Climate change affects all of us. The impact is felt with extreme weather, wildfires, droughts, melting polar ice caps, rising sea levels, food shortages, and the scary thing is, these are only a few of them. There are two paths that can and should be taken to protect the Earth and in turn its inhabitants, and these paths are concurrent. One relates to habit and the use of our built environment. Last year we discussed Local Law 97 at the boot camp, and what can be done to reduce our carbon emissions in New York City. And that in order to be successful, we not only need to retrofit our building systems and certain physical aspects of our structures, but also our patterns, our routines, and choices of what energy sources we use. But that's only part of solving the puzzle. In order to survive, and here I mean both individual weather occurrences, but also as a species, we need to be more resilient in what we build or retrofit. There are those that argue about causes of climate change. And although there's much debate about it, there's no refuting that it is changing. So debate all you will about the cause of it. We can fight that challenge and we can fight that change successfully by building and retrofitting better and in a more resilient fashion. Tonight we will hear from 4 experts on the battle against climate change. We won't have all the answers, but hopefully some of those answers will direct what a property owner can do to survive and flourish. So to begin the session tonight, after our esteemed panel introduces themselves, I'm going to pose some questions for them. I was asked to announce if anyone is here for continuing legal education credit, they need to sign in at the beginning of the program and also at the end of the program. But we can start now, so I'm going to start with you, Emily, if you introduce yourself and if everybody else can introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. Emily Rubenstein. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Resiliency and Sustainability at the New York State Office of General Services.
Hi, I'm Lori Rothenberg, Lead Counsel, Global Real Estate and Workplace Strategy at Pfizer. I support Pfizer's real estate portfolio from the strategy, implementation, and sustainability aspects. I'm also involved with IWBI's Investing for Health Advisory, which impacts, they look at measuring the S.
Hi, I'm Mark Jackson. I am the General Counsel for the mixed-use real estate campus in Sunset Park called Industry City. Prior to that, I was counsel for Two Trees Management in Dumbo, and then just up the river, I was the Assistant General Counsel for the Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation. Right after law school, graduated Brooklyn Law 2011. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Mary Willis White. I'm a partner at Raines Feldman Luttrell, building out. Actually, we're new to the East Coast. It's a West Coast firm, so I'm excited to bring the commercial real estate practice together in New York. And like Mark, I'm a BLS grad, 2013, and also now teaching a clinical seminar here as well on transactional real estate, which is really great.
Okay, thank you all. So I'm going to start with you, Emily. New York State is one of the leaders in sustainability efforts, both relating to the buildings it controls and also the energy that is produced for statewide consumption. Some of Governor Hochul's efforts include the Environmental Bond Act for green schools, development of offshore wind, pollution mitigation, and efforts to reduce flood risks. But there are so many other New York State efforts in the pipeline, so would you share and update us with some of them?
Sure. Thank you so much. So first, really excited to be here. I should say this is a really exciting time to be working on sustainability and climate issues in the state. Governor Hochul passed is supporting the climate law that was passed several years ago. It is one of the most ambitious climate laws in the nation. It sets several key targets. So one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2030, and another is to reach zero emission electricity sector by 2040. So two really ambitious targets. My agency, the Office of General Services, supports these efforts through a few different ways. So we are property stewards for state property. So we have about 20 million square feet across New York State. We support other state agencies through procurement, leasing services, and our fleet services. And so that's where I'm coming from, and we support other agencies in their efforts to institutionalize sustainability and really help support implementation of the ambitious climate goals. So with that, a couple of really, I think, exciting pieces that the state is on its path to doing. So the first has to do with renewable energy, and that's one where we've had some exciting successes recently. We've seen, you've probably seen some press announcements around offshore wind. So we have an incredible pipeline of renewable energy right now, which of course is going to be key to achieving that reduction of greenhouse gases. So once all of our buildings switch over to electrification, we need a clean source of power. And so the state has been pouring a tremendous amount of investment into the renewable energy sector, leveraging a lot of federal dollars that are coming our way. So there have been really exciting opportunities there, billions of dollars from the state going into both renewable and on-site energy, solar, throughout the state. So that's one piece that we're really excited about. Another, which is going to be contributing to reduction of greenhouse gas, has to do with a new program that's currently being rolled out by the state called Cap and Trade, which will have decreasing limits on greenhouse gas emissions from large polluters, mostly fuel providers. So that's another big advancement that's going to be coming out soon. And the third is around buildings, which is a shift in our building code. So just recently, last year, there was a law passed that said that New York State had to update its building code. Specifically, new construction must not have fossil fuels, basically be electric, all electric, in the next several years. So that is a big shift. The code will also include several key resiliency pieces. While New York City has adopted some of these pieces already, the new construction piece is quite radical and will be a significant shift. So with that, those are three key pieces. Happy to go into more detail on some of those. But
And I will have you go into more detail in a little while. But now for Mary Willis, Mark, and Lori, now that we have a good idea of what New York State is doing with respect to sustainability and continued resiliency, what are property owners doing and how are they paying for it? So,
Big question.
Yeah. I work with property owner directly, so I'll take that on initially. My work as primarily a commercial leasing attorney, but also full-service general counsel, touches on the work that we're doing for resiliency and sustainability, I'd say in three key ways. So the first one being things that we can fund to increase our, decrease our carbon footprint and become more in compliance with local law 97 so that we achieve that 40% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. That involves a very wide array. It's a scattershot approach. I think the greatest savings we've had over the last couple of years has been switching from steam heat gas-powered steam heat or fuel-powered, depending on, we have 16 different buildings in the campus, to heat pumps. So these magical devices that have been around forever that can bring in heat from the outside even when it's freezing. And I'm not an engineer, so it really seems like hocus pocus, but these are incredibly cost-efficient devices. So air conditioning, heating, all electrically based. That's been, I'd say, the biggest investment that we've put in because of NYSERDA. That's a state agency that has provided tax credits for that. We also are a huge believer in green spaces throughout the campus, which is as much marketing for our tenants and for our clients who come shop as it is a resiliency effort. We are on the coastal edge of Brooklyn, so everything from the flood we had in September, of course, Ida and Katrina included, just knocked us out to varying degrees. So to the extent we could have permeable surfaces and be ready for storms, that's a huge win, just to keep our campus able to bounce back from any from any 5-year storm that might happen 5 times a year, as the commissioner was explaining. And then the third aspect that I think is notable is working with our tenants to understand their energy consumption. And this really is driven by Local Law 97, because in all of our leases, even if it's a temporary 2-day pop-up agreement, we have a clause saying the tenant needs to be ready for any penalties that they cause us because of their energy consumption under Local Law 97. And as the commissioner mentioned, it really is a dress rehearsal for now, because the real penalties won't begin until 2030. And we think we're in compliance. All of our buildings would have to be 110% occupied for us to exceed the carbon emissions under the 2024 to 2030. But we work in this language to all of our leases to force the conversation of what happens if the tenant exceeds their pro rata. We use somewhat arbitrary metric of how we allocate our energy consumption to each tenant. I won't say arbitrary. It's more, it's a weighted scale depending on what the tenants do, but not all industrial tenants are built equally. Not all office tenants are built equally. So we're learning how best to allocate the pie of emissions. And so in some ways, I feel like a cap and trade broker in my lease negotiations, because I'm, and it all comes down to the language and how we theoretically would pass along a penalty, how we provide notice under a penalty that, as the commissioner mentioned, we might not receive for 2 years after the fact. Where will that tenant be? How will they pay that penalty if it's owed? And we can get into the details of that later, but those are 3 ways that we're investing in being ready for increased resiliency, to sum up.
I'm going to give the classic lawyer answer is it depends. Some of my clients are very focused, and it's part of their strategic plan. It's part of their core, founding mission to make sure that they are ahead of the game, even if they're in New York, that they're ahead of the game on what they can do for their tenants, for their building, for their investors. Across the board, it's really part of their ethos. And I also have clients who are scraping by, hoping to be able to make the mortgage payment because, let's say, it's a multifamily property in northern Manhattan, and they bought in 2018, and then the rent laws changed in 2019, and none of the papering of, none of the numbers work out anymore. So it is really, are we looking and being proactive? In some cases, and in others it's very reactive, and we're going to eke out whatever we can to make sure that we're in compliance for the next 4 or 5 years, and cross our fingers and see what the market does and how we might be able to help fix things before we start talking about what 2030 is. So there's just a real range, and I think, as our keynote speaker so eloquently put, we have to figure out how to help people wherever they are. So the small buildings in the outer boroughs need to have that that leg up to make sure that they understand what is going to be required and how to get there, and we have to hold their hands through the process. And some of that is about the funding, and some of that is about the day-to-day technical, like you go onto the website for local law 97, and it's actually a very user-friendly, from my perspective, because I don't have to comply, but to try to walk somebody through it, it is a user-friendly site where, you know, if you have questions, you can go here. Here's where you need to, you know, click this box, and it'll take you to the next set of information. So it depends.
So I'll talk from, I mean, we have property that we own, and then we also have property that we lease. And at this stage, most of the property that we own are our manufacturing plants, which really are our big sources of emissions. I think 60% of our emissions are from our manufacturing plants. From a property owner and or a property tenant perspective, I think there's, the approach can be site selection, right? I think is a very key consideration in terms of targeting your resilience. The lease negotiations obviously need to incorporate whatever resilience measures you want to take down the road, and we can get into that a little bit later, specifically what you would maybe want to put into a lease. Your operations and your design, right, as to how are you designing the space. And then it's also your behavior and the culture of the company, if it's a company, or your occupants, right? So how are you encouraging the people, the occupants that are in the space to actually use it so that any of the resiliency features that you design are being used correctly? We have, in terms of the site selection, really been building out, we have an environmental health and safety diligence checklist that has to be reviewed for whatever sites that we are looking at, and it includes a lot of things on the resilience front, like how does this property impact the neighboring properties? Is it near any physical risks? What's the stormwater risk? What's the potable water availability at this site? What's the crime levels, right? So it doesn't have to only be natural resources, but it can also entail a lot of security type of questions, just to look at kind of how is it going to be on the day-to-day for the operations and for the occupants that are there. And so our environmental folks will look at that list, and what we've done is we've layered into that list, which was much more traditional environmental, we've layered in sustainability considerations, a lot of which were taken, from LEED type of checklists, like how close are you to transportation, and are there certifications, or what's happening with the energy efficiency, which maybe isn't necessarily like an immediate risk, but longer term for climate change, obviously it is. So we look at all of that, and then if we decide that we're going to move forward with the site, then we start designing for resilient operations, and then move in and operate.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've been talking about resiliency, and we've been talking about sustainability. So although sustainable development and resiliency can be the same, how in your minds are they different? Are the state and private property owners looking at them as a pair, or are they dealing with them separately? So keep in mind, although for long-term property survival, resiliency is mandatory, there are factors relating to sustainability that are separate, like compliance with local law 97. That's really more on the sustainability side, energy reduction, carbon reduction side, than it is necessarily on resiliency. And yet we've got these two things that we've got to pay attention to. So I open it to everybody on the panel.
Sure. I think one key thing that I'll say from the state perspective and thinking about state assets is really helping communities and clients understand what their climate risks are, right? We're facing not just one hazard, whether it's flooding or wind. We're facing climate events that have multiple hazards. And the way in which we are designing buildings is going to need to change fundamentally. We're not going to have to think just about, as we did with COVID, about air exchange. We're going to have to think about how do we actually prevent air from coming in a building if there's a massive smoke condition due to wildfires. I think in a lot of ways the resiliency and discussion is about understanding what your climate risks are on a very site-specific basis. And the state has been doing a lot of work looking at both what are the impacts to different communities across the state, and also how can we start thinking about incorporating those risks into the design of our infrastructure, into our how we build our buildings.
Yeah, I think of sustainable development and resilience almost like the way that people talk about sustainability and ESG. One is outward looking and one is inward risk protection, right? So sustainable development to me is how is your site, how are your occupants impacting the ecosystem that's out there, right? The people, the community, the resources that, whether they be local resources or the larger supply chain. So some of the considerations there is like, how do you comply with zoning rules? How do you comply with environmental regulations and other types of building codes? And then also, how are you impacting the community? Then when you go to resilience, it's, okay, how are all of these external factors, whether they be climate change, it could be political, it could be like a war that's happening nearby, or it could be anything that's external, right? How is that impacting the occupants, and how can you mitigate the risk from those external factors? And I think that our challenge here with this resiliency is kind of stepping out of that like resilience box and starting to be able to say, okay, we know that we're property owners and we're private property owners, and so we have to worry, our ownership rights is this building, and that's all we want to worry about. Well, no, we really now need to start thinking broader, and how do we impact the community and the environment around us and the broader climate.
Yeah, it's a great theoretical, concept, just resiliency, sustainability, it's a yin-yang thing. And I think, similar to Emily and Lori, I view it as both a short-term versus a long-term planning exercise. Short-term resiliency, you need to be ready to defend yourself for smoke conditions, for an outage, almost by any means. And today, as opposed to a sustainability plan, which is long-term and is global and puts you in the context of your city and your laws, state, federal, local. Today, before coming, I spoke with our chief engineer, who is a brilliant engineer, not the most green-minded person, politically, I would say, but knows all of these things. He knows Local Law 97. He and I debate it constantly. And I asked him about the chief resiliency versus sustainability plans he has. And he said, well, it's ironic because the biggest project he has on his books right now is beefing up our demand response infrastructure, which would be our ability as a campus. We have our own energy plant. So we buy wholesale energy from Con Ed, and then we step it down in this gigantic plant. It's the orange building next to Industry City, if you've ever noticed what that orange, or wondered what the orange building is as you're driving down the BQE is. But he is investing $1 million or so to beef it up so that when the city needs more demand response, when everyone turns on their air conditioners, we can feed into that. That will involve us burning fossil fuels to have like a peaker plant additional backup, which is obviously ironic. It's burning of fossil fuels to provide a resiliency response to the city, but that's necessary because of where we are until the time comes when all the offshore wind is online, and then we can rely on a more electrified grid for resiliency and sustainability. So currently, resiliency means doing all things, including increased fossil fuel consumption, but hopefully, in furtherance of a long-term sustainable plan.
Right, I think that's exactly, I mean, we're all talking about the same thing, right? So the goal would be that sustainability also includes being resilient for whatever happens next happens. But there's also this immediate need for, like, how do we handle what we think is coming in the next couple of years? I think of, what are the 4 Ps of sustainability? The planet, the people, the profit, and the purpose, right? So you put all of that together and try to make sure that you've got this long-term strategic plan, but you do have to say, like, okay, if my building floods, what do I do? Yeah.
Could you just move your speaker closer?
Oh, sure.
to me?
Yep. Better?
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for letting me know.
So, I mean, all of you touched upon this, so you're right, and our keynote speaker mentioned we cannot just look at the period in which we are for compliance in New York City with Local Law 97, 2024 up until 2030. So for each of you, what are your constituents, your stakeholders, actually, are they focusing on long-term and short-term? Are they just focusing on short-term? Mary Willis said that she has some clients where, they're lucky if they can just focus on short-term. But, in order for us to get where we need to be long-term, we have to always keep in mind what needs to be done by 2030, 2040, et cetera. So how are each of you dealing with that?
Start. So one of the biggest challenges we have in my agency, we manage 20 million square feet of real estate. For those of you who have been to Albany, you might be familiar with the large campus that was built around 1960 or so. Not much has happened at the Capitol from a structural perspective in that time, unfortunately, and we have a very large deferred maintenance challenge. And now that all these major critical systems are, I don't want to say failing, but they need to be changed over in a lot of ways, it presents a huge opportunity, right? So we have this opportunity as we switch over these critical systems to shift to decarbonized. Now, as we know, that's a very expensive proposition, but it is a huge opportunity. So I think one of the key things, if we are going to reach our decarbonization goals, our GHG reduction goals, is to really identify those opportunities when buildings are switching over major critical systems, to really look at where the return on investment might not be perfect at this time. However, looking at how you can capture and really take and leverage when you're making an investment in your building, to always look at, well, I know that in 10 years, if I did this, I would have to do X. Let's do it now. And how can that help the operation of my building? How can that help our energy efficiency, et cetera?
Yeah, I would say that for us, it's largely long-term with limits, right? Because you always have to have that business case. And in a lot of instances, there is a business case. So for example, we had, you may have seen in the news last year, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, there was a tornado, and it blew the roof off of one of our warehouses. And we had, lots of medicine that was supposed to go to patients, couldn't get shipped, and was destroyed. And so the company's very focused on the patient, right? And so we were all very aware that with each day passing, people could not get their surgeries, right, because they didn't have this medicine. And so there was a real push to not only get the supply chain back online, but also, to get the building back online. So we had to, find a replacement warehouse, obtain that, quickly negotiate the lease for that replacement warehouse, and then all while, bringing back the other one, which is an owned site, back up and running. And so that was a really good example to me of, where resilience comes into play. And a lot of it is the bottom line, right? Because if this happens, if any of these climate risks occur, that's money out of our revenue line, right? And so we want to be able to protect that with investments. So we're going to make those investments that are going to protect us from those risks as best we can. We also have a net zero goal for net zero by 2030. So our, barreling towards that and figuring out where are the best levers to achieve it, right? Now, all of that said, you are going to have, right, if anytime you have a project, and there's a lot of different resiliency measures you can take, it's kind of, okay, which one do you take? You're not going to necessarily take all of them, so you still need to have that business case. And right now, we're in a different economic situation than we were maybe a year ago. So those decisions become more difficult. And on the leased properties, it becomes even tougher, right, than in the owned properties. But I will say that the other piece is that we have our employees in the sites, and so, very much like the buildings, you're worried about like the physical structure of the building, but you also want it to be resilient because you're dealing with people's lives.
Well, I'm curious, when did your net zero 2030 plan get put into place? Like, how long has Pfizer been talking about that? And
Sorry, it's net zero by 2040. Sorry.
2040.
Yeah. I feel like it was 2021, maybe.
So pretty
2020.
recent.
Yeah, yeah. But we've had carbon targets over the years. They just keep getting updated. So for a while, it was no greater than X year. So they've been working on cutting the emissions for years.
Yeah.
Can you just explain to the audience what net zero means? Because maybe some people don't understand that.
So basically, we will not be emitting. It's instead of reaching all of, because you want to eliminate all of the carbon emissions from your operations. So there are emissions that come directly from your operations, or they can also come, there's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and it can come from directly from your emissions from your operations, and then it can also come from your supply chain as well. And so, for example, like our leased properties would be in that camp. The net zero is saying, okay, we're not going to simply purchase RECs, which are renewable energy credits, as an exchange for the carbon, but we're actually going to eliminate these sources of emissions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That's very ambitious. I commend Pfizer for that, and hope you guys get there. As a commercial real estate landlord in Brooklyn, we view sustainability investments as much about attracting tenants to us. Commercial real estate has changed dramatically since COVID. It had changed dramatically before COVID because of short-term working, WeWork, and other changes in retail with Amazon. We won't go as far as committing to net zero. There are certainly commercial landlords who have done that, and there's commercial landlords who are pledging to be fully electrified. Like there's a new building by the Alloy Group on Flatbush with a big sculpture of a outlet on its wall, which is a really cool branding effort. It is, at least according to their marketing, the first all-electric building in New York, which is, I think, commendable. So we're investing in these things to be sustainable because we have to be, but also when tenants come to us, they more and more have questions about the campus, about how we power things, how they have access to heat pumps versus steam heat. So for companies with ESG goals, for companies who are B corporations, that's very much part of their checklist of compliance or things that they can do to attract talent and retain talent. More and more as office tenants grapple with whether they have a 5-day versus 2-day back-to-work policy, convincing their staff members that the campus that the office is in is ethical, is healthy, is more and more in discussion. So we do a very wide array of things to be attractive to tenants in the office space, for them to tell a great story and a real story to their staff about being part of a green-minded campus, on top of the amenities that attract workforce, like an on-campus gym and great food and beverage, but being able to, assure tenants that their staff will feel good as being part of a more green-minded campus is very, important for them. So it's long-term, it's short-term, and it has to do with us and our main client base, our tenancy, which is everything for a commercial real estate landlord.
Yeah. Just to piggyback off of that a little bit, for some of my clients, the equivalent of the tenant there is actually the investor. So you're coming up with a new fund and you're trying to say, like, come and invest and we're going to do good for our community. And so being able to talk about the sustainable and resilient pieces of those goals and what they're going to invest in is really important. And then you build something wonderful, and hopefully you have tenants who are also on that same wavelength and value what is sustainable and what that client has put together, and then it all sort of works in harmony. That's really the goal. But people are definitely talking about it in a way that my hope is that we continue to find funding. And I think there are a lot of private funds, private companies now who are looking to deploy some of this capital that's out there in the world, and they want to make sure that they are also investing in sustainable projects.
So now, Emily, I warned you before I was going to put you on the spot. So I'm going to put you on the spot now. So we were talking about, like the private property owners and paying for it. So with the state, so who's going to pay for the sustainability and resiliency efforts that the state is implementing? So is it going to come from tax revenue? Is it going to come from increased utility rates? And then thinking more broadly, I teach a sustainable building law course, and quite often I say to my students, technology is your friend in the green building world, because we've seen technology, advance so much even in the last 10 or 15 years. So maybe at some point, solar, the output from solar and wind will have batteries that actually could keep this energy, and we won't lose it, or we'd have it for more than a day, period. So what's the state's, take on how this is going to get paid for?
Sure. No, that's a great question and a huge challenge. One exciting thing that's happening, you had mentioned it earlier, in the state is the Environmental Bond Act. And that is a $4 billion pot of money that the state is basically breaking up into pieces to distribute to both municipalities, communities, and to be administered by state agencies to improve the resiliency and ecology of communities around the state. So there is a huge opportunity there to further a lot of the goals that are outlined in the Climate Act, a lot of the activities we've talked about to date, and look to really help bolster the resiliency of a lot of different types of communities. And the other piece that the Bond Act calls out is around equity. And this is a really unique aspect of the Bond Act, and something that's sort of being focused on more and more right now is prioritizing investments in disadvantaged communities. So, you talk about sort of how is this going to get paid for? How do we pay for this work? And I think the state spends a lot of time talking about, rightfully so, how to avoid disproportionate impacts to disadvantaged communities. And so there are a handful of agencies that have been allocating and designing funds and programs for specifically ensuring that disadvantaged communities are not disproportionately impacted by the energy transition. Rid talked about this earlier, that the buildings that have to comply with Local Law 97 and potentially have higher bills to pay for their energy that may be renewable in the future, we need to make sure, the state needs to make sure that those communities are not shouldering a disproportionate impact of this transition. And so there's, subsidies and investment in whether it's from an electric bill perspective, whether it's from rebates, whether it's through opportunities for multifamily affordable housing to decarbonize. So those are all sort of key pieces of the transition. I think the other side of this is really making sure, again, with the just transition, is to ensure that there is workforce development, and that, when you talk about who pays, there's sort of the upfront cost, but then there's also sort of the resulting challenge of how do you ensure that the workforce is trained for this huge shift in different kinds of systems that we have, right? So we want to make sure, and the state has been doing a ton of investment in workforce development. State Department of Labor has numerous programs partnering with both SUNY and CUNY and a lot of different organizations to ensure that both, folks in every sector are really making sure that they will have a job when we move to decarbonization and when we move to electrification. I'll pause there. Is that?
Yeah, no. It's, I think, and we really only have time for one last question, and I guess this question sort of interrelates among all four of you. One of the criticisms of Local Law 97, and the commissioner spoke about it in his keynote, was that, we came up with this policy, this great idea, but then we had to figure out how to implement it and to police it, which we didn't do a great job of. And it was only until, and he mentioned it, this past fall that we actually came up with a solution for those properties, like the condos and the co-ops that he mentioned, that we're saying there's no way we're going to be able to comply as of January 2024. And then they came up with, starting the conversation. Laura Popa, I don't know if you know her, but she was one of our speakers last year. And she's in this. This is her, baby. And trying to figure out this good faith effort, what it means, how to comply, et cetera. Is the state speaking with enough private property stakeholders to be able to figure out, okay, so we can address the communities that may not be able to afford it, but just generally throughout the state, how we're going to be able to pay for it? And do you feel, as with your clients as private property owners, that in fact you have a voice in what's going on, or they're just two disparate, organizations?
So I think that the city and the state are talking to companies, right? Because they need the companies to be bringing back those individuals, for example, so that they can go to the stores, go to the restaurants, et cetera, right? For the economic benefit of the company, of the city. So those conversations are happening. I am not sure, don't think that those conversations are covering, oh yeah, and we need you to also do XYZ for resiliency. That said, a lot of companies, there is such a flight to quality, right, in so much of like the corporates, that's becoming much more of a norm, at least for a lot of the buildings. But I do think that there should be more conversation. I don't think that there's enough.
Yeah, I totally agree with Commissioner Agrawal's distinction between the large property owners who we really shouldn't worry about because they have lobbyists, they have consultants, they have data, they have platforms to measure, and they can know within a few percentage points where they're going to fall on any new law. I also work for my co-op, so I, as a volunteer lawyer in a 90-unit co-op, which will probably be paying fees under Local Law 97. That's an example of the sort of building that is not prepared. And we have a management company, and it's a pretty well-run co-op, but that is the other side of the equation, and I would hope that the state is doing all the things that the commissioner was talking about preemptively, to talk to the wide swath of smaller, large but not so corporate stakeholders in the built environment, to know where they're going to land, to help them get tools ready, because there are so many tools with the data. As Professor Sobelson was saying, technology really can be your friend, and there's some pretty cost-effective devices and platforms that can be used to get smarter about these things. So if the 90% of non-corporate owners throughout New York State could get really smart on that before these laws go into place, like we wish we had with Local Law 97, then the implementation will be much easier. But Industry City is already very well aware of what these laws would mean for us, so it's less of a concern, I'd say.
I do think it's a matter of resources just across the board, kind of in a sort of common sense way. Like the people who have connections and some money and ties and have been in the community for a long time are the ones who have consultants and lobbyists and get a seat at the table for the conversations. It's not apparent from where I sit, and I'm not sure that it would be necessarily, what the city or state can and should be doing to make sure that everybody is heard in a timely fashion, because it's always a moving target, right? So as we looked at Local Law 97, like there's been quite an on-ramp. So at the very beginning, who else should have been part of that discussion? It's a hard question, and hindsight 2020.
I'll say two things. So one is, just from the state perspective, affordability and equity is critical to Governor Hochul, and that's why we're spending so much money, both with the Bond Act, through NYSERDA funds, subsidies, et cetera, on ensuring that there is that support throughout the transition. So just to reemphasize that point, I think I'm not as close to the city unfolding of the policy, but I know that is a critical aspect as we decarbonize, ensuring that we're not pricing folks out. So, and the other piece that I wanted to mention is that on the technology side, I actually just this morning heard an amazing story about how the city and the state can drive innovation and drive technology. So post Sandy, and I'll just bear with me this one story, but post Sandy, a lot of the critical systems in NYCHA properties were put offline. They didn't have heat, they didn't have air conditioning, and in this moment, there was an opportunity to decarbonize. And one of the leads at NYCHA had said, well, what if we develop and sort of challenge industry to develop a window unit heat pump? And they actually were able to do this. And through that innovation, through a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, there's been this incredible product developed that is now going to be deployed in hundreds of units across NYCHA and is incredibly cost effective. And so I think that they're, paired with this transition, I think there are a number of agencies that are investing in companies that are doing incredible things with R&D and with the energy transition to make it so that it is not, going to bankrupt small buildings across the city, and make it easier and more comfortable for New Yorkers to have decarbonized homes. So.
Okay, great. We have time for just a couple of questions. So I have a student volunteer with Mike, but okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Liz. Sean has a question.
I can try to be loud enough. I'm just really curious about this heat pump, this window unit. Is it enacted, and can it be a source of income for the city also while we solve this problem?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of, I would say with the NYCHA example, happy to share the link because I think it's such a great story. But it is now being commercialized. So with a lot of new technologies, there is a need from that was articulated. The government provided seed funding for innovation, and now it's going to both be deployed in lots of affordable housing, but also be available on the broader market eventually. So.
Other questions?
I haven't totally figured this question out yet, so I will ask it to you, Lori.
Okay.
As a company that has a portfolio that I'm sure spans a variety of states and a patchwork regulatory scheme as a result, is there a point where some of the more progressive legislative, like the legislatures in some of the states where maybe some of the requirements for your buildings there are perhaps higher than in some of the other states, is there a point where as a company you make the decision to sort of like retrofit and design your properties to sort of like meet that highest standard, or is it really kind of a wherever your building sits is the, you know, you design and you retrofit to what that state requires? Is there a point where it sort of switches over and as a company you make the decision that like in North Carolina we've already met whatever statutes are in place, but wouldn't it be something if we kind of like up the ante and we actually sort of like match what New York is requiring out of us, even though we don't have to with our North Carolina facility? Like, is there any sort of appetite for that within the folks making those decisions at a corporate level for you all?
Yeah, so we have design guidelines, right, that are enterprise-wide, and then on top of that, we have green design guidelines that get into the sustainability features that need to be put in. We don't design to code specifically. Like we design, we comply with code, but we don't use that as our target of our design. So the one thing that, like for example, we have facilities in California, right, which is going to be one of the higher standards. And so we're going to meet whatever is required there, but it's not necessarily, we're not restricted by whatever the code is, right? So we do what's right. For example, because you could go to a country, because we're global, right? So we're in, you could go to a country in Europe or Asia that doesn't have certain requirements, and we're still going to do it. And that becomes a challenge, right, when we're negotiating with a landlord and we're saying, hey, we want to have, X, Y, and Z on that diligence checklist that I was talking about earlier. And they're like, what? We don't have that, right? And so then we have to figure out, okay, is it something that we can implement at our cost, or is it something that we have to just say, forget this property? Yeah.
Okay, at this point, I would like all of you to help me and say thank you very much to our panel.